Is there anybody in psychology who's more controversial than Sigmund Freud? Well, I suppose Jordan Peterson would be a contender. I mean, even if you ask my students, people who have maybe studied psychology for a couple years, I say to them, hey, what do you know about Sigmund Freud? First things that come out of their mouth is that he was a cocaine user and that he was also sort of a sexual pervert. In fact, people start to make this connection that maybe all that cocaine use made him come up with all these weird sexual theories that are just so strange and bizarre. Even if you ask my colleagues in psychology what they think of Freud these days, most people don't really give him the time of day. We generally blow off his theories, and I've even made a video about this, about why Freud is no longer considered scientific by the psychology community. But here's just a little sample of what my own colleagues think. Describe your take on Sigmund Freud in one word.
Retro.
Wrong.
In one word. One word. Nonsense.
I think he was a very smart, kind of independent, brave fellow. And I think that he made major contributions that psychology, contemporary social psychology, well recognizes.
Describe your take on Sigmund Freud in one word.
Why are you asking this? Do you have any issue with Freud? Do you have an issue with authority figures in your fields, family, father? I think it is highly suspicious to ask this question.
Hello there. In this video, I'm going to do a deep dive on Sigmund Freud. I want to go ahead and talk to you about his life, where these weird ideas came from. We're going to cover his clinical practice, the different theories that he proposed over the years, and talk about how he went from Vienna to London. Keep in mind that one of the things I don't talk about very much at all here is his cocaine use, because I don't think the cocaine use was really a major role in his life. It was something that he dabbled with a lot in the early part of his career when he was trying to see if it had any kind of medicinal qualities, but I don't really think it had much to do with his theorizing, and I don't think that this all wacky stuff comes from being a cocaine user. At the end of this video, I'll give you some advice about books you might want to read to follow up on Freud, and some of the sources that I actually used to create these lectures that I'm about to present to you. So, without further ado, here's my lectures about Freud. Freud was born in 1856 in Freiburg, Moravia, which was then part of the Austrian Empire and which is now in the Czech Republic. His father was a merchant, and his mother was 20 years younger than her husband and his third wife. Freud's family moved to Vienna when he was 4. Being Jewish, they were optimistic about a new era in Austria then, in which special taxes and restrictions on Jews had only recently been removed. In 1873, when he was 17, he entered the University of Vienna, where he planned to study law. Instead, he went into medicine, not because he wanted to be a conventional physician, but because philosophy and science fascinated him. He was a brilliant student and researcher, and he ended up working with several famous professors in psychology at the University of Vienna, including Brentano, Brucker, and Maynard. He didn't receive his degree until 1881. In 1882, he now has a medical degree. He fell in love, though, with Martha Bernays, and he became secretly engaged to her because he was too poor to establish the kind of respectable bourgeois home that he and his fiancée thought was essential. It was not until 1886, some 5 months after he had opened his practice in Vienna, with the aid of wedding gifts and loans from affluent friends, that they were allowed to finally marry. And within 9 years, they had 6 children, the last of whom, Anna, grew up to be her father's confidant, her secretary, his nurse, and an eminent psychoanalyst in her own right. This picture you see here actually is, I think, shortly after they got married in 1886. Now, just before this marriage, Freud went to Paris to study with Charcot. A number of Freud's patients had complained about hysteria, so one of the things that he wanted to learn about from Charcot was how he dealt with hysteria. And he was particularly impressed with Charcot's use of hypnosis in the treatment of patients with hysteria. Charcot was equally impressed with Freud and gave him permission to translate his writings into German. After attending these lectures by Charcot, Freud then returned to Vienna, eager to apply all the new techniques. and he began collaborating with Joseph Breuer, who attended the university with Freud. So Freud and Breuer worked together at first, introducing the bare outlines of psychoanalytic theory in a series of papers in 1895.
Oh. Hey, I hate to interrupt here, but if you are enjoying this content, would you consider subscribing to my channel? It's the best way for me to find out that you're there and to know that there's people out there who actually enjoy this kind of content and want to see more of it. So let's get back to the lecture.
So there's a lot of research done on Freud in his life, and he's a very interesting person. We could really probably go on for a few hours here just talking about his life and all the things that he ended up writing about and so on. I want to highlight some major influences on Freud's thinking. First of all, remember that he was trained as a medical researcher, which meant that he was more inclined towards careful observation and analysis rather than experimentation as a method of investigation. Freud was much more of the kind of person who was going to do case observations and analyses, and that reflects his medical training. Secondly, evolutionary theory, which most of the leading biologists at this point had adopted as fact, had already been around for 20 years when Freud received his medical degree. And he himself was very much taken with Darwin's work and often referred to evolutionary theory. So that does permeate through his thinking as well. The third thing to keep in mind is that consciousness was really the big ticket item there in psychology at that time in the late 1800s. Titchener and even Wundt really didn't think it was possible that they were even interested in things like the unconscious or things that you couldn't have access to. So they weren't even interested in the operations of your brain that you couldn't reflect on. Freud, of course, thought it was very interesting to pay attention to consciousness, but he was also interested in all that other stuff. And he considered the mind evolved from these more primitive, non-reflective, irrational substrates. He's thinking consciousness probably evolved quite late, and that would mean that our brains still had lots of other sort of primitive substrates that could be tapped into with his techniques. And finally, the fourth big influence is that he was surrounded by the achievements of the natural sciences. So, for instance, Helmholtz had proposed that energy was never lost, it was only conserved. And Freud knew about Helmholtz and what was going on in physics. And so, therefore, he had a very positivistic, deterministic, physicalistic approach to understanding these processes. So, that is, he strongly believed what he was doing was part of natural science. And so he looked for evidence. He believed that things could be determined and follow the laws of physics. When Freud first returned from Paris, it didn't go so well at first just to try to do this stuff that he had learned from Charcot. In fact, what happened was he gave a lecture to the Vienna Medical Society, and he reported Charcot's theory of hysteria to this Viennese group. And he talked about it very positively. But one of his professors that he had still there at the University of Vienna, Maynard, objected to this theory, particularly the part suggesting that men as well as women could be hysterics. So he wasn't well received because of this lecture and his beliefs about Charcot. And Freud felt from that time forward he lost favor with this Viennese medical establishment, and therefore became an outsider. He soon found he could make a living by treating ordinary neurological cases because the other doctors weren't referring them to him. So even though he had, by that point, bolstered his reputation by writing well-received books on cerebral palsy and aphasia, his own practice wasn't going very well. So he decided that he's going to have to start adding to his income by accepting more patients with hysteria, since he was among the very few Viennese doctors at that time who had the background and willingness to take the symptoms of hysteria seriously. And so many people came to him for help. When Freud was in France, he had visited Bernheim and Nancy, and he had watched a recently hypnotized subject showing typical post-hypnotic amnesia until Bernheim, the hypnotist there, placed a hand on his forehead and said, "Now you can remember." And when he said that, the subject immediately recalled his entire hypnotic experience in minute detail. Freud wondered, maybe that would work with his patients to help him figure out the origins of their pathogenic ideas. Now, pathogenic ideas was a fundamental aspect of his theory about hysteria, that he believed that the patient held some sort of idea in their unconscious that was causing them all their misery. So the pathogenic idea is this kind of core idea that they're having little conscious access to. So he wants to help them get to that. He wants them to find that pathogenic idea. So he devised a pressure technique where he would have patients lay on his couch with their eyes closed as they would be for hypnosis, but they would remain normally awake. And then he would ask them to recall their earliest experiences of their symptoms until their memories stopped just before getting to that crucial pathogenic idea. So like they can remember all these early experiences of when they had these symptoms, but if you kept pushing them, they maybe would resist to tell you what the crucial pathogenic idea was, or they didn't have access to it. So at that point, Freud would simply press their foreheads with his hand and confidently assure them that their further memories would now follow. And after repeated application of this pressure, some apparently genuine pathogenic ideas would come out, followed by an emotional catharsis and symptom relief. The patient would show relief of their hysterical symptoms. Now, he did have problems figuring out whether he was on the right path to a pathogenic idea. So as this person's talking about it, he's got to decide whether or not to put more pressure at this point or another. He eventually decided that he just better go ahead and take all of the paths. That is, he thought that everything that the patients reported was potentially significant, even if it didn't seem important at first. So he pretty much just wants to listen to everything they have to say. And finally, he realizes that he doesn't even need to apply the pressure at all with his hands. All he had to do is to encourage these patients to let their thoughts run free, even if it seemed the thoughts were irrelevant or stupid or embarrassing or whatever. And this became the method of free association, which became his standard method of treatment. He believed it led reliably to pathogenic ideas. So with his colleague Breuer, Freud published a case example of this method called Anna O, which was actually a pseudonym for a woman named Bertha Pappenheim. And what they argued there was that Anna O and other hysterics have these pathogenic ideas that are causing their misery. And he said there are three things about these pathogenic ideas. First of all, they're overdetermined. And what he means by that is that the symptoms themselves have multiple causes. There might be multiple pathogenic ideas causing the same symptom. So, for instance, if they feel some sort of numbness in their hand, it might be that there's one pathogenic idea that has related to something they did with their hand once that they're not consciously able to remember. Or it could be that there's a completely different experience, a different pathogenic idea that also causes them to feel that their hand is numb. So overdetermined meant that he often found that a lot of these symptoms they had actually had multiple pathogenic ideas underlying them. Secondly, he found that these pathogenic ideas would be repressed. So this is the whole idea that people don't want to bring the ideas to their consciousness. They want to keep them repressed and kept in the unconscious. And therefore, you have this intrapsychic conflict where basically as the therapist is working with the patient, they're trying to bring these things to the conscious, the pathogenic ideas, so they can have a catharsis and be freed of the tension that this is causing. Normally, the pathogenic idea is down there in the unconscious and it's being repressed and it's causing all sorts of conflict for the person, which then manifests itself in the neurosis or in the hysterical symptoms. And that conflict is going to be resolved if you can bring the pathogenic idea up to consciousness. Now, what's causing those pathogenic ideas? He speculated in a theory that he published in 1896 called the seduction theory that all of these hysterics had undergone some sort of sexual mistreatment as children. So he found patient after patient, as he would explore their symptoms and try to understand their pathogenic ideas, that ultimately it would go all the way back to some event in the patient's past when they were children where they had been somehow sexually mistreated, that there had been some sort of sexual abuse. And so he speculated that what happened was, after that sexual mistreatment or that sexual abuse had happened, that the person had developed symptoms as a function of defenses against the psychologically dangerous pathogenic ideas, that they were embarrassed, they were shamed, they felt horrible about this event that happened in the past, so it had been repressed. They weren't consciously aware of it, but this repressed idea was causing them psychic conflict, which then manifests itself in these symptoms of hysteria. So it's an interesting theory that he was observing firsthand by his actual patients reporting real sexual abuse from when they were children. The interesting thing was that about a year later, he no longer subscribed to this theory. That is, he no longer thought that the theory held up to the fact that all of them had undergone sexual mistreatment. He thought that a lot of them had just had fantasies about sexual mistreatment. So what he was trying to say is it doesn't matter whether the person really had sexual mistreatment or they imagined that they did. Either one of those causes a pathogenic idea that's causing them to have these defenses and causing them, therefore, to have their hysteria. So it's like he's basically saying, I don't really want to question whether or not this is actually something that this person experienced in the past. What's more important is that we bring up this fantasy or this belief or this memory that's been held as a repressed idea and bring it to the forefront. Now, interestingly, a few decades ago, this author that you see in this book here, Jeffrey Masson, published a book called The Assault on Truth, Freud's Suppression of the Seduction Theory. And what he argued here was that Freud actually changed his theory to be accepted by the medical establishment, that it was too upsetting, according to Masson here, to have Freud going out there and saying, my patients have all been sexually abused. That would be too shocking and too unaccepting then of the Viennese society. And so because of that, he changed his theory so he'd be more accepted. That's what the book argues, and he looks at this through letters and discussions that he had with his colleagues. The only real problem with this is that we have established that Freud was already on the outside. That is, Freud was never actually accepted by the medical establishment before this even. So in some ways, he probably could speculate a theory like this and would have little ramifications because he wasn't accepted by the university community. He wasn't really accepted by the Viennese Medical Society. The only people that were really listening to him were his patients and a few other adherents to his growing ideas about psychoanalysis. So I tend to think that this book has probably got it wrong, but I just wanted to bring it up as a possible explanation for why his theory did change about a year later. Now, another important development in Freud's thinking was dream theory. And his reliance on dreams, or why he put so much stock in them, had a lot to do with that free association technique that I was talking about, where you'd have this patient lying on his back and the person's talking about different things. And one of the things that he realized is that people frequently wanted to talk about their dreams that they had recently. And so he would explore with them their dream. He would say, tell me about your dream, as much detail as you can remember, and then used free association to help them further decompose or understand their dream. And so he, from observing other people's dreams and also keeping a dream journal himself and looking at his own dreams, he started to come up with an explanation for these dreams. And he published this in a book called The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900. In that book, he distinguished between what we consciously experience as the content of the dream, and that he called the manifest content. So the manifest content is the story that you remember, the weird details that you can actually report to somebody else or write into your journal. That's the manifest content. The other important aspect of dreams, though, is their latent content, which are the elements that are actually inspiring the dream, like why you're having the dream. And a lot of this has to do with symbolism and meanings about things that you have in that dream that only you associate with. Or maybe culturally everybody associates that the symbol means something. But anyway, what you have to do then in order to really understand the dream is go from the manifest content to the latent content, and do that through free association. And if you have a really good analyst, like Freud considered himself to be, they'll be a good guide to help you get through and to understand what the real meaning of your dream is, what the content of that dream is. Just to give you an example, one of the dreams that he talks about in his book is his own dream of Irma's injection. So he had dreamed of a social gathering where Irma, one of his real-life patients, had fallen ill and was given an injection of the chemical propyl by one of his medical colleagues. Then Freud vividly hallucinated the letters and numbers comprising the formula for trimethylamine, yet another chemical substance. This strange manifest content made little immediate sense to Freud, for neither propyl nor trimethylamine was a real medicine, and a propyl injection would in fact have probably been dangerous. So he used free association to help him figure out several ideas that kind of would make sense, like what these things really represented. For one, Freud thought with relief that at least it was not he himself who had administered this ridiculous injection, so his colleague would have to bear the responsibility for any unfavorable outcome. Further, he remembered that in real life, Irma's nose had been operated on by his best friend, who had neglected to remove all of the surgical packing. The patient, legally under Freud's care, had nearly died. Though Freud had made excuses for his friend and had been unwilling to blame him for negligence, he now had to admit to feelings of anger and reproach. Finally, he remembered a recent conversation with this same friend about the chemistry of sex, in which the substance trimethylamine had been mentioned. This led to the thought that Irma's illness must have been sexual in nature. So this sort of fragmentary analysis illustrates how he would just take one manifest content of a dream and then spend time trying to understand its latent content. And hopefully through analysis of the latent content, you would be able to get back to the pathogenic ideas. So dreams and hysterical symptoms, he hypothesized, resulted from similar unconscious symbolic processes. So there are like multiple ways that these pathogenic ideas can manifest themselves to consciousness. You can see them in your manifest content of your dream. You might see them in hysterical symptoms. He even talked about this in terms of jokes. And so he wrote a book called The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, where he talked about slips of the tongue, or what we call a Freudian slip, or jokes that when you tell the joke, you sound like you're being humorous, but maybe you really are telling the truth. So these are all ways for our unconscious symbolic processes to manifest themselves to our consciousness. The other thing that's interesting about his idea about dreams was that he believed that all dreams represented the fulfillment of wishes. And so that was an hypothesis that he worked on, and believing that basically what your dreams really represent is what you really wish was going on. That once you get to the latent content, will tell you what you're really striving for, what your real motivation was. So maybe, for instance, he was actually sexually attracted to Irma, and that's maybe why he was having this dream. So that's another aspect of this that he talked about in the interpretation of dreams. So now let's talk about some major aspects of psychoanalytic theory as proposed by Freud. And we'll start with sexuality. In fact, it's probably what most people think about when they think of Freud, is his emphasis or his focus on sexuality. And he published this book in 1905 on 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. And what's interesting about his theory of sexuality is that if you think about it from the time point when he was actually developing it, that all the way up through the late 19th century, people viewed childhood as a period of sexual innocence. That people generally thought of children as not even having any interests in anything sexually. So one thing that was revolutionary is that Freud's going to say that children actually are sexual. Freud also believed that Oedipal fantasies and many kinds of sexual activities were common in children. And this becomes a fundamental aspect of his theory of how the human psyche works. And he postulated that there was a human sex drive that's present from birth, which is capable of gratification in many different ways. So even though a young child isn't going to have sex, the child still has the sex drive and will find gratification maybe from putting things in its mouth or touching itself and so on, that are not ways that would actually be considered sexual, but are still capable of giving the child some gratification. So we should turn now to the Oedipal fantasies and the Oedipal complex, the Oedipus complex, I should say. And this comes about from the fact that Freud went to the theater one night and saw a production of Oedipus Rex, a Greek tragedy that was written by Sophocles around 429 BC. It tells the story of Oedipus, who has just become the king of Thebes. And long before the play opens up, though, Oedipus was born to Laius, the king of Thebes, and his wife Jocasta. Shortly after the birth, the father, Laius, has received a prophecy that his infant son will one day murder him. So, worried about this, that his son might murder him one day, Oedipus is taken away by a servant and abandoned on a mountaintop and rescued by a shepherd who raises him. And nobody has any idea who he actually is and who his parents are. As an adult, he approaches Thebes and encounters the Sphinx that you see in this picture, who has been devouring Thebians one by one if they could not solve her riddle. So people would pass by here, the Sphinx would pose a riddle, and if you couldn't answer the riddle, she would eat you. And so this was a curse that was affecting this town, because everybody goes by, this is going to get eaten by the Sphinx. So the Sphinx asks Oedipus a riddle. What is the creature that walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 in the evening? Oedipus answers the riddle correctly, which is man, or a human, and the Sphinx ends up throwing herself off a cliff and thus ends the curse. The city of Thebes is so excited about this that they reward him by making him the king, and they give him Jocasta, his birth mother, as his wife, which he accepts because, of course, he doesn't know this is his mother, and no one else knows the truth at this point. The king, by the way, had been murdered long before. Well, in the play, Oedipus is now going to search for the killer of his father, the previous king, but it takes a while to realize that A, he killed his father during a fight several years before, and B, he has married his mother, Jocasta, without knowing it. And in fact, they've had children. When all the truth finally comes out in the play, Jocasta is so upset she hangs herself, and Oedipus stabs himself in his eye, blinding himself. He becomes dependent on his two daughters, Antigone and Ismene, who eventually he has to send out. So you can see this is a picture from a play in which you can see that Oedipus has just gone ahead and stabbed himself in the eyes. Here he is with Antigone, who's one of his daughters. And like I said, because he's worried about them and worried about all the ramifications of the truth coming out, he sends them away. And he ends up being a broken man for the rest of his life. Now, Freud, like I said, saw this play, and he was quite moved by it. And he ended up writing about it first in The Interpretation of Dreams. He believed that this play presented a universal urge that boys grew up with. That is, that they grew up with a sexual attraction to their mothers, and that they also feared being murdered by their fathers. And this was basically something that was universal, that this play had tapped into. He later changed his theory a bit to argue that really what was going on here in the Oedipus complex was that any child's unconscious desire for their opposite sex parent would occur during development, and they would end up hating their same-sex parent. But later in their development, they would have to overcome this hatred for the same-sex parent and identify with them. If they fail to do this, they're going to have a lot of problems. So that's the Oedipus complex in a nutshell. You might remember in the last lecture that I showed you how Freud collected a lot of ancient artifacts. He did this because he often found them to be evidence of common themes and motivations that he thought that all humans at all times had experienced. And so he looked at these as evidence of the universality of what drives humans to act the way they do. That's why he was so taken with them. We now have a little bit of an understanding of what the Oedipus complex and where it comes from. So let's now go ahead and talk about how he thinks this all works in terms of the development of the child. So he says, infants are born with this sex drive. But at the infancy level, it's really the child is born into a state of what he called polymorphous perversity. That is, pleasure comes from stimulation of any part of the body. As the child grows, this infant grows, some body parts are going to become singled out for pleasure. And these are known as erogenous zones, and this will keep occurring through development. For the infant, the main source of pleasure is going to be in the mouth or the oral zone. So they're going to be touching themselves around their mouth a lot. They're going to be bringing things to their mouth to taste and to put to mouth. And he called this the oral stage. And then later on, when the child's going through toilet training, it's going to become important to be able to control one's bodily functions, and this becomes pleasurable. And so this is known as the anal stage. So once the child can have voluntary control over his or her bodily functions, you now have this anal stage. After the anal stage is passed through, then the child enters a latent stage. And what's going on in the latent stage is all of this Oedipal conflict, where remember that they hate their same-sex parent, but they're sexually attracted to their opposite sex parent. And by the time they get through the latent stage, they need to resolve this. They need to be able to identify with their same-sex parent and no longer feel threatened by them. By adolescence, the pleasure now comes from the genitals. So this is known as the genital stage. And then you move on through that to adulthood. So he thought that the neurotic problems that arise when you're an adult happens because the person wasn't able to complete a stage successfully. So if something happened to interrupt that stage as the child is going through the oral stage or the anal stage or latent stage, then the adult would be fixated on that stage, not being able to resolve it. And therefore, that's where the neurotic problems would come from. You can see that he really believed in this very strongly. In this quote here, the behavior of a human being in sexual matters is often a prototype for the whole of his other modes of reaction in life. So he's really putting a lot of emphasis then on sexuality. He took pains to stress that the Oedipal complex and childhood sexuality are never destroyed. They're just merely repressed. So if you see a child who doesn't have an Oedipal complex or there's no sexuality going on, it's because they're repressing it. These feelings always persist beneath the surface of consciousness, seeking whatever indirect and disguised forms of expression they can find. Dreams would provide one natural and usually benign outlet for this, but hysterical symptoms would be a more extreme and maladaptive one. Freud came to see that much of everyday behavior was an attempt to resolve these conflicts by this largely submerged sexual drive. So it leads us to the next aspect of his theory, which is the differentiation between consciousness and the unconscious. So keep in mind that psychology was largely focused on consciousness. And so he thought that if psychology continued to only focus on consciousness, it would miss a lot of things. There would be too many gaps in a psychology just built around consciousness. He does believe it's important. Consciousness plays the role of monitor, but all other aspects of mental life are unconscious, according to Freud. The unconscious is, quote, any mental process, the existence of which we are obliged to assume because, for instance, we infer it in some way from its effects, but of which we are not directly aware. So that's going to pose a difficult problem. How do you show that the unconscious exists if we're not actually aware of it? He says you look for its effects on consciousness or in behavior. There's only one more little twist here. We also have the preconscious, and that would be those processes that are able to become conscious in the sense that they're reproduced or remembered. So a lot of things that are in preconscious kind of dipped in between consciousness and unconscious. And so things that do make it to conscious but are normally unconscious would be called that they're in the preconscious. So the preconscious is a gray zone between consciousness and unconscious. I would just say the other thing that sort of happened just before the war was that you do get more of a coalition or organization of psychoanalysis because more and more people are attracted to Freud's ideas and are passing them on to their students. You have these disciples of psychoanalysis. So you get the founding of the International Psychoanalytic Association. There's the founding of the American Psychoanalytic Association that happens after Freud and Jung have visited America. But then within a couple of years, followers start to break away and they start to form their own schools. And then we have World War I, and of course Vienna was right in the heart of it because it was actually the assassination of the heir to the Habsburg Empire who started World War I. So in the 1920s, he resumed a lot of his writing and thinking, but now he became much more focused on the human psyche as well as its implications for society. And some of his most important books were published then, like Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920, The Ego and the Id in 1923, The Future of an Illusion in 1927, and Civilization and Its Discontents in 1930. Let's go first to the Beyond the Pleasure Principle and talk a little bit about this. This is where he really starts to go into instincts and talks about Eros and Thanatos. So this is again published in Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920. He says that instincts have 4 characteristics. So we all have innate needs, and that these innate needs give rise to tensions or forces that he calls instincts that ultimately cause all of our activity. Unfortunately, it was translated into English as instinct, but a better word to use here might be drive. That is, we have these innate drives, and they have these 4 characteristics. They have a source, so it's usually going to come from internal body stimulation. It's not external. So for instance, it might be a feeling of being sexually deprived, for example. That would be the source. Then there's an impetus, which is the amount of force in the energy of the instinct. So it's kind of like the strength of this instinct. And so it might be that it's your motivation to seek out some object of desire. That's your impetus. And it might be a really strong need to seek out this object of desire. And then there's an aim, which is basically the goal of this instinct is to abolish the conditions of the stimulation from which they arose, which then makes you feel satisfied. So hunger would be one of these instincts or drives, and it has as its aim to abolish stomach pains. And the 4th characteristic is that instincts have an object. That is, any person or thing that serves to satisfy the aim of an instinct is the object. So, for instance, if it was a sexual instinct we're talking about, a loved one or your partner would be the object, because that person helps you satisfy your aim. Now, he takes all of these instincts that we have and he kind of groups them into 2 fundamental groups. The life instincts are those that are involved in reproduction. So, for example, sex, and life maintenance. And those would be things like hunger and thirst. Psychoanalysts from the start almost exclusively focused on these sexual instincts. Sort of forgot about the ones for life maintenance. Libido was the name that they gave for sexual energy. And overall, if you put libido in with the life maintenance instincts, the 2 of them together were called Eros, the life instinct. But as Freud's thinking developed, he started to focus more and more on the reproduction aspects of it. And so libido became synonymous with the energy of the life instinct generally. So even though that was the name just for the sexual energy, it now becomes the energy associated with Eros. The other big group are the death instincts, which he called Thanatos. He believed that, as in physics, every force had an equal and opposite force. So he proposed that this death wish, Thanatos, is an opposing force to Eros. Unlike the life instincts, the death instincts perform their work silently. And because of this, it's not been possible to identify their source very clearly. Only in the case of aggression, which Freud attributed to the death instinct, are the manifestations visible. Normally operating internally and having the goal of death, that is, that each person is said to harbor an unconscious wish to die, the forces of Thanatos are fused with or counterbalanced by the forces of Eros. But if Thanatos gets out of control, it may be that its death instincts are turned outward, which would be things like sadism or destruction or murder, or it may be turned inward, like masochism, self-mutilation, self-derogation, or defamation. And so, depending on where Thanatos is pointed, if it's pointed outward or inward, you'll see these sort of destructive things that reflect this death instinct, Thanatos. And he argued in this book that the intensity of the hatred and violence and destruction that he saw in World War I was what convinced him that we did have this deep-rooted instinctual origin of aggression. And so he felt that he needed to account for this directly in his theory, and that's how he did. This next big work was in 1923, and that's The Ego and the Id. And here's where he proposed this mental apparatus that I think most of you probably heard about in some way or the other. We have the id, the ego, and the superego. And so now he had a way that he could try to explain all of behavior and thinking as some sort of interaction between these different parts. So the id was considered to be the oldest, most primitive of the three parts. Freud described it as the obscure, inaccessible part of our personality. It can be imagined only as a chaos, a cauldron of seething excitement. It contains everything that is inherited, that is present at birth. So the id is a reservoir of instinctual energy, and it's regulated by two principles, which these instincts are. One is called the nirvana principle, and in the nirvana principle, the organism just seeks to maintain at as low a level as possible the quantities of excitation that are flowing into it. And he believed that the nirvana principle, this kind of calmness that you seek, is related to the death instinct. The other guiding principle for the id is the pleasure principle, and it has its goal, the increase of pleasure and the decrease of unpleasure or pain. This id is operated by what he called a primary process. That is, the id wants to discharge its instinctual energy as soon as possible. Ordinarily, it's discharged in the form of impulses or wishes. And if this can't be fulfilled easily, then the primary process produces from memory a mental image of the desired object and makes a connection to it called a cathexis. So the energy becomes invested in this object from memory. The problem with the id is it can't differentiate between reality and fantasy. Thus, the organism can't just live on images alone. And then we have the ego. The ego, like the id, pursues pleasure and seeks to avoid unpleasure. But its pursuit takes into account reality, and thus it's said to be governed by the reality principle. As the ego develops, so does the reality principle come to replace the pleasure principle in self-preservation. It mediates between the id and the external world. The ego thereby controls the motor apparatus, your bodily functions, you're moving your arms around and so on. And so it's more organized and logical. It discharges its energy through a secondary process. And this involves continuously testing reality by comparison of your memory with those of things in the present. So you're always comparing things from the past that you've learned to things that are going on in the present. And so that's how you discharge your energy, is through a comparison of what's going on in the past to the present. That's the reality principle. That's a secondary process. It's not so immediate the way the primary process is. And then we have the superego. And this is the last to develop in personality. Through the ego's contact with the world, certain consistent patterns of influence are experienced and internalized. And these patterns reflect society's values, the ethics, the morals, the ideals, and the taboos as they are interpreted by your parents or your primary caregivers. It's characteristic of the superego to strive for perfection, as contrasted with, for example, the ego's striving for reality. The superego contains not only the model of the perceived parental responsibility, but also the ethnic, national, and family traditions, the demands of the current zeitgeist, and later influences of teachers, public figures, etc. And in the picture that you see on the right, you can kind of see how these three parts are related to each other and how they relate to the conscious and the unconscious. That is, the ego, much of it actually is consciously there for us to be aware of. But you notice that some of it's in the preconscious, and some of it even gets into the unconscious. The id is completely in the unconscious. So we never have any way of connecting to it. The superego bridges across all three of those, between conscious, preconscious, and the unconscious. Well, in his final years, he basically was running for his life. What happened was in 1933, the Nazi Party took over in Germany, and among the books that they decided needed to be banned and burned were Freud's books. All this stuff about sexuality was very threatening to the Nazi Party, and so they said it was obscene writings, obscene theories, and his books were banned and burned. Then in March 1938, Nazi Germany annexes Austria. And you remember, Freud lives in Vienna, the capital of Austria. So he knows his days are numbered. If they're already burning his books 5 years before that, as soon as they can get their hands on him, his life's going to be in danger. So for the next 2 months, April and May, he worked with some people around the world who helped him escape Vienna with his family. And they did this through its stages, basically, where they moved some of his furniture, some of his things to different locations across Europe. And eventually he got his whole family to London. One of his primary benefactors was somebody who was very much taken with psychoanalysis, and she was a woman who was a descendant of Napoleon Bonaparte, and she lived in Paris, and she put him up in Paris on his way to London. But eventually, in 1938, he gets to London's suburb of Hampstead. He became a celebrity right away when he got to London, and everybody wanted to see him. In fact, some of the people who came to see him were people like Salvador Dali, that should be Virginia Woolf, H.G. Wells, and a lot of prominent scientists and thinkers. However, in these final days that he was in London, he was really deteriorating pretty fast from cancer of the jaw. He had this for like 5 or 6 years, and he had been taking all sorts of medications to try to treat it, but it was becoming more and more difficult for him to even talk. And he would have to basically feed him through a small hole in his mouth. So he arranged to have fatal doses of morphine given to him in September 1939, and then he died. I'm going to go ahead and show you a home movie that if you end up going to the Freud Museum in London, you can actually see more of these movies. They have them playing in a room there. This particular one I found on YouTube, and you'll hear Anna Freud narrating this film. This is just, again, in the final days of his life, so you get a little bit of an idea of both how Anna Freud speaks about him, his daughter, and how Freud moves around.
My father is here with a very old friend of his who already went to school with him in Vienna. He later became an archaeologist, professor of archaeology in Rome. He used to come to Vienna once a year in the autumn and then inspected the new additions to my father's antique collection, and they stayed great friends all their lives. He was especially nice, lovable man. In this picture, neither of these two men knew that they were photographed, and that is why the whole thing is so natural. My father didn't like to be photographed and usually made a face when he noticed it, but here he didn't know. I think this is really the best picture of the whole movie. Again, my father and Yofi. She was a beautiful chow, very affectionate, very lovable. My mother on the left and her sister.
If you'd like to learn more about Freud, where you really should go, though, is just start reading some of Freud's books. He's got so many very easily accessible books that are out there. I've given you some links down below in my description about some places you might want to start. The one I recommend the most highly, though, is kind of like the first start, is to read Dora, A Case of Hysteria, which is a case history of one of his patients that he had very early on in his career when he was first sort of starting out. And you really get a good sense of how he interpreted things, how he would deal with a patient. And what's really fascinating in this case is that it wasn't a successful therapy outcome at all. And so he wrote about one of his first failures in that case history. So again, if you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to my channel. I plan to put out more things about Freud and psychology in the coming weeks. And if you are subscribed, you'll get notifications about them. So thank you.